and probably. The second thematic session is to do with a question that I think probably everyone in this room has grappled with at some time or another. What is effective interdisciplinarity? And probably we'd all agree that interdisciplinarity is hard. It doesn't just happen because you bring people together. It requires much more than that. So we're going to hear about the experiences of our four speakers. I'm going to introduce them when they come up to speak and not go through at the very beginning. Anyway, I'm going to say a couple of things at the beginning. One, very strict timing. Speakers, 10 minutes, and somebody, who's the timekeeper? Where are you? Somebody's going to be waving. Right, thank you, Trevor. You're going to be waving a 1 minute sign. So we'll keep an eye on Trevor. I want to welcome everyone here in the room and everyone joining online to this session addressing really quite an important question for all of us and for Access. So Ian Walker from Swansea, our first speaker, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and it's very nice to be here. I'm really enjoying this event. It's the first one I've managed to get to in person, so thank you, Patrick, and the other organisers. So I've spent probably something like 17 or 18 years working on interdisciplinary projects, especially with engineers from all the different areas of engineering. So it was really interesting to sit down and reflect a little bit on those experiences. And I realised it's kind of gone in two phases. So I'll just quickly work through two phases of that experience, as well as a few lessons I think have come out for how we can try to avoid getting stuck in disciplinary silos. We were just talking this morning, Emily, Kass and I were just talking this morning about the thing that often goes wrong, which is we'll pull the social scientists in just to do the evaluation of this project, and very often at the last minute. And I've certainly got the scars on my back from quite a bit of that sort of thing in the past. Although even there, I think there are opportunities to be smart about it. So I had a horrible 3-year period of my life doing the evaluation of a massive electrical engineering project, but was able to do some what I thought was actually really cool social science along the way. And discover some things about energy consumption that I think we've probably never seen before. So, yeah, there's lots of opportunities there. Slightly contradicting what Susan said a second ago, though, I would say the bulk of my experience of collaborating with other disciplines, especially your sort of hard science and engineering disciplines, has actually been incredibly smooth and has largely felt like pushing on an open door. Because it feels to me like in the last 15 years or thereabouts, the world of engineering especially has just hit this point where everybody has simultaneously realised, we don't understand human beings. And people literally have been knocking on my door saying, look, I need help with this. So I remember a good example would be Chris Brace at Bath, who runs the automotive engineering research centre there. And took me for a coffee and said, listen, we're at a point now where I could spend 5 years making an engine 2% more efficient, but you put the wrong person in and it will use 25% more fuel. And that is now my challenge as an automotive engineer, is understanding the bag of meat in the driving seat and how that affects any fuel consumption. Because the engines are optimised, they've done that. It's now about the user. Elsewhere, people have just sort of beaten their path to try and solve this. So the very first bit of work I did in this space, civil engineers came and said, listen, we've built a stadium, and sure enough, they built in there, because they have much better facilities than we do, they built 3 enormous tiers of stadium seating in a laboratory with the whole thing on springs so that people could stand on it and jump up and down and see what it feels like to be on a bouncy structure at a sports event. And they said, right, we've just built this, and we just realised we don't know how to work out how it feels. Can you help us work out how it feels to be on a stadium as everybody's jumping up and down and it starts to feel a bit dangerous? And so that was my introduction, was this, we've built this thing, we've just recognised that we need to understand human experience. Can you please come in and help us do that bit? And that's just opened huge amounts of that. So I've done that sort of thing with structural engineering, done that sort of thing with electrical engineering, doing loads of work on energy understanding, energy literacy, demand-side response, all of this kind of thing that can inform things like energy markets modelling and things of this sort. So that's been incredibly interesting. And I think along the way, you come across different models of working. I've got to say, it is probably easier to work multidisciplinary than interdisciplinary. Multidisciplinary is quite easy. You all agree, okay, I'm going to do this, you're going to do that, we'll meet up in a month and see how we get on. And as long as you're all good at your jobs, that tends to work really well. And one of the risks with interdisciplinary working is it's very easy to spend a lot of time sitting around teaching each other first-year undergraduate material from your own discipline. And that's one of the things that you kind of got to watch out for. The other sort of key challenge in that work is very often that people don't understand the collaborations. And I found there was quite an important bit of storytelling about the collaborations that you do, so that people go, hang on, why is a psychologist and an engineer working together? And very often the story is about the problem you're trying to solve. And drawing attention to the actual practical, real-world challenge is very often the way to make sense of that to people, including funders, of course. And I was just saying to Gary, if you want to learn to write amazing grant applications, go and work with engineers, because they are so much better at it than we are. Their grant applications are just... So go and look at how they write and internalize that lesson, because, oh my God, I've learned so much from working with those people. So phase one was a lot of that kind of thing. A lot of people knocking on my door saying, can you come and help us with the human or the social elements of this thing that we're doing? And that was a fantastic sort of 12, 14 years or something like that. I think some of the things that popped out as an interesting challenge along the way were things like the places where there are structures where we've accidentally embedded monodisciplinarity. So probably the best one, I can't remember who first made this observation, but probably one of the worst places where we've embedded single discipline thinking is in our degree programs. And someone suggested, actually, you probably wouldn't have departments of X at departments of Y if it weren't for the existence of BSc degree programs. And so that's one of the things, that what we teach in some ways fights against the interdisciplinarity that we might like to see in our research. And there's probably opportunities as we all look to modernize our teaching to maybe start to say, well, could we have interdisciplinary dissertations? And that's certainly something we're exploring at the moment. Could we have practicum-style interdisciplinary dissertations where you force together a bunch of students from different disciplines and get them to work together to solve a real-world problem? Because that's what the world needs, and we could be building it into our education and thereby fighting down some of this monodisciplinarity in the way we work. The interesting thing that's happened has been phase two, which is probably best captured in the project that we're running now. So at the moment, we've got one of the UKRI cross-council projects for a project called LOCAST, which is looking at human experience of tall building motion or sustainable building motion in design guidance for future building construction. And there's a few things that's interesting about it, one of which is it's super interdisciplinary. It is civil structural engineering, physiology and psychology working together. And I'll say something in a second about how that works. The other thing that's particularly interesting about it, and the reason I would describe this as phase two in my career, is I'm the PI on that. It's no longer psychology working for the engineers. It's psychology pulling in the engineers to gather around a human challenge, which happens to have a big engineering impact. And that's been a really refreshing, quite exciting shift in the dynamic. And it's no longer the junior partner, and that's quite a nice thing for social science. Probably as a final lesson, and I hope we can manage within 10 minutes here, one of the things that I think has made that project work so well and made it easy to sell to funders, but also to work amongst ourselves, was very explicitly coming up with a theory of change or a systems map of the problem we were trying to solve. So in this case, we were saying, buildings, if you make buildings with sustainable materials or less material, they will move more. That is structural engineering, no arguments. If this building were vibrating now, it's going to affect our bodies, right, when you're some physiologists. Your body picking up the vibrations of the building, that's going to feel weird, psychology. the combination of those three disciplines becomes incredibly obvious and, in fact, almost hard to ignore when you've got the process map of the problem that you're addressing. And so that explicit mapping of the steps in the process was key to pulling together the right partners, justifying the partnerships, and selling that story to the wider world. So that's probably one of the main things I'd leave with is do the systems mapping of the challenge, and then the disciplinarity falls out almost naturally. Thank you.
We're going to move straight on to Gary Kass. You have various affiliations, Gary, Surrey and Imperial. So
lovely.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, so I'm Gary Kass. I'm affiliated to the University of Surrey as a visiting professor in the Centre for Environment and Sustainability, and also the Centre for Environmental Policy at Imperial College. And until September of 2023, I was Deputy Chief Scientist and Deputy Director for Foresight and Innovation at Natural England. I've had, some people have called it a checkered career, other people just called it a long career. And somebody once said, I don't have so much skeletons in my cupboard, but an entire graveyard. So I'm going to try and share some of my skeletons with you. Right, can I move this on? Here we are. So I'm going to talk about this, Beyond Boundaries. Literally last week, a paper published in Geo, with thanks to Karen. Thanks, Karen, she's in the audience somewhere, for her support in that. And it's a kind of reflective piece for me, looking back at some of the experiences I've had around this kind of boundary space between science, policy and practice. And because Susan was convening us today, I've kind of referred to her absolutely brilliant book that you absolutely must read, which is all about the history of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. It was published back in 2015, which seems a ridiculously long time ago now.
It was.
But,
not as long as it took to write it.
But it's an absolutely fabulous book for many, many reasons, and I could do an entire presentation just on that. So I'm going to talk about this notion of boundaries and borderlands between science policy and practice, and why we must cross them, give you some examples from my work in policy and practice, and then attempt to be bold enough to offer some thoughts around what I've referred to as necessary conditions for boundary crossing, and then leave you with some takeaways. So the boundaries and borderlands. So the relationship between science policy and practice, I've kind of talked about it as three sides of the same coin, which of course is inherently complicated. And that's exactly what it is. It is not a linear chain that runs from science to policy to practice. It is a messy space, and it's more like a Venn diagram, and the degree of overlap of the lobes of the Venn diagram is quite variable and quite dynamic and shifts all the time. So because they are, the interfaces between these things are complex, dynamic and unpredictable, rather than refer to them as boundaries, which you might see as quite a fixed and quite delineated difference, I've referred to them in this notion of borderlands. And I published a paper on this a few years ago with colleagues at Royal Holloway, and very happy to share that as well. And it talks about borderlands as spaces in which the complexities, dynamics and unpredictability of the interfaces between these things can actually be negotiated and continually negotiated. But of course there are all sorts of rationales as to why we want to do this as well. And fundamentally, no one has the monopoly of wisdom, either in terms of their discipline or their methodology. And we live in an increasingly VUCA world. Now VUCA is an acronym, if you haven't heard it. It refers to the world as being volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And I think we've all experienced over many years how volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous the world is, and increasingly so. And in that space, that notion that no one has the monopoly of wisdom becomes even more strong. So we're faced with those kind of situations. These are some of the roles I've been occupying or currently occupy. So I led the Environment and Energy Programme at the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology for many years. I'm an ex-chair, now currently vice-chair of the Institute of Environmental Sciences, and Ethne Childs is in the audience somewhere. Ethne's over there. Ethne works for the IES and she's brilliant, so talk to her about that and please join. That's the plug. I've done that. And I have to thank Ethne for asking me on Patrick's behalf to do this talk today, so thank you for that. I'm also a member of the College of Experts for the Office for Environmental Protection, and as I mentioned, my Natural England heritage, and was involved with the first Access Task Force as a critical friend towards the end of that process to talk about aspects of engagement, and are currently a member of the current Task Force on Nature Recovery. And as I said, see also Susan's excellent book, because that was also really foundational for me during this checkered history in terms of how it affected the working with the Commission. I didn't work for the Commission, I worked alongside people in the Commission on a number of areas, so hugely useful. The paper that I'm going to refer to particularly talks about some examples from just a few of those, because the editor said there wasn't enough space in the paper. I'd have to have an entire journal to write examples from all of those. But it focuses in on the work that I'm involved with in the Institution of Environmental Sciences around policy, but also the IES. In fact, on Monday, if you happen to be in London on Monday morning and you've got nothing to do, come along to the Dialogue Between Disciplines conference, which is dealing entirely with this subject of how do we actually facilitate and enable people to work across these different disciplines and boundaries and borderlands. And I'm going to be basically saying there what I'm saying now, so Ethne is going to hear it twice really. But it also focuses on some work that I did with the Office for Environmental Protection, because like the Climate Change Committee that has to report on progress against the Climate Change Act, the OEP has to report on government's progress towards the Environmental Improvement Plan. And what they want to try and do there is to be able to get ahead of just looking backwards to report progress, to actually look at prospects. So they drew on me as a member of their College of Experts to help them think about what they refer to as prospective analysis. And that is inherently an interdisciplinary idea, because the drivers of change that lead to environmental outcomes are coming from society, they're coming from technology, they're coming from economics, they're coming from policy.
You've got the 1 minute sign, Gary.
Thank you. So this is my pitch really, that there are 4 conditions for boundary crossing. You've got to want to do it. You've got to have the right intentions, and you've got to do it for the right reasons, not for performance sake. Do it because there's a problem that requires it. It doesn't happen by itself, so you need to create the settings. You have to make it happen. You have to make sure you ask the right kinds of questions, from which then emerge the right kinds of methods. And you've got to involve whoever needs to be there, but make sure you lead the process. It doesn't happen by itself, as I said. It needs to be convened, and somebody once described interdisciplinarity as a contact sport, which I think was an absolutely brilliant thing. So that's the pitch. There's more in the paper. Please read it. There's a link is on there, or ask me afterwards. I won't do the illustrations to Susan's book, I haven't got time, but these are quotes from Susan's book that kind of illustrate these conditions. And these are my takeaways. It's necessary, crucial, vital, essential and urgent. It's challenging but also offers opportunities. It's founded on the credibility of the science, the salience of the evidence you do in relation to the topics you're studying, and the legitimacy of the process that you operate. And it's enabled through these 4 necessary conditions: the intentions, the settings, the questions and the people.
Thank you very much. So now we move on to our final speaker, Helen Roberts from the Met office. Helen, look forward to hearing it.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, thanks for having me here today. So I'm Helen Roberts from the Met office. I'm a socio-meteorologist, which is quite a cool job title. The socio part is a fairly recent add-on. So my background is in the physical sciences, in operational meteorology, and I did that weather forecasting for a variety of customers and sectors for many, many years. And then about 5 years ago became really interested in the social sciences and how the Met Office and meteorology could benefit from the social sciences. That's not to say it wasn't already happening, it certainly was, but there's so much more that we can do. And it's interesting that we've got these world-leading experts at the Met Office in terms of the physical, the natural sciences, more recently the data sciences. But given our Met Office purpose, and I'm going to go all corporate on you now and recite our Met Office purpose, which is helping people to make better decisions to stay safe and thrive, that's all about people and decisions, which is very much the social sciences. So it's interesting that although we had this brilliant mission statement, that we somewhat hadn't recognised the importance of the social sciences. This diagram by Golding et al. Is quite famous in the world of meteorology. It's a representation of the value chain of forecasting. And it sort of takes you through from the observations through to the dissemination and understanding, and importantly, that decision making on receipt of forecasts and warnings. And it also highlights that there are these bridges between the valleys, and if any one of those bridges fails, then the whole system fails. And I'm sure there are similar diagrams in other disciplines. And the reason I wanted to include this diagram is just to demonstrate that the boxes that I've put around the edge are various examples of interdisciplinary work and projects that have involved the social sciences, and that, as has been acknowledged multiple times throughout this assembly, the social sciences are often seen as the bit at the end, the communication. And yes, that's a big part of it, but it's not the only part. So I like this diagram because it demonstrates the importance of the social sciences right the way through the value chain. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about a particular example of some interdisciplinary research that I'm doing at the moment, or just coming to the end of. I'm currently doing a part-time PhD, and it's with psychology department at the University of Bath. My supervisors are psychologists and behavioural and decision scientists. So I guess the research is, this piece of research, it's with our meteorologists, and it's understanding and analysing and assessing and evidencing the decision processes of the meteorologists when issuing warnings, but it's using social science expertise and methodologies to do that. So this, for those of you who aren't familiar with what our national severe weather warnings look like, that's a screenshot from our website when we had the 40 Celsius event back in 2022. And our warnings are impact-based, and we use this matrix, which is impact and likelihood, to issue warnings, which to the user appear as a colour, so yellow, amber and red. And because they're impact-based warnings, as opposed to threshold warnings, which they used to be prior to 2011, so what I mean by that is a threshold warning would be, is the wind forecast to exceed 60 miles per hour tomorrow? Binary decision, yes, a warning's issued, no, it's not. And we realised that wasn't particularly useful because a wind speed of 60 miles per hour will have very different impacts depending on where and when it is, and extraneous factors around that. So it's a risk-based system, so we're factoring in the hazard, which is meteorological, and the vulnerability and exposure of people, assets and infrastructure, and that's not meteorology. And particularly when it comes to people, of course, people are differently vulnerable at different times because they move around and they do things and they behave in ways which aren't always predictable. So we have to factor in all of this or the meteorologists do when they're issuing impact-based warnings. So my research methodology was using testbed experiments where I observed decision-making in an experimental context where they were working in groups and therefore having to verbalise the decisions that are normally, I liked Jenny's example earlier of the black box of decisions. So I was sort of I've been trying through this research to extract the decision process from the heads of these meteorologists. So via experiments, via interviews, and also via observation and shadowing whilst on shift, making the decisions in real time. And this is sort of the findings of my research so far, which is that I've tried to categorise the decision process into this table. So we've got 8 factors, each of which have many considerations. And this is a sort of broadly chronological process, although it's of course not completely linear, and there will be some back and forth. But broadly speaking, most meteorologists will start their decision process by looking at the numerical weather prediction, the model performance and characteristics. This is probably the most objective part of the decision, but even this, they're already factoring in or utilising their experience, their local knowledge, their understanding of the characteristics of different models that they're comparing. And then when we move away from numerical weather prediction, then we become increasingly subjective. The meteorologists are factoring in, are using information that is not readily available. It's tacit knowledge, and that makes it a really incredibly complex process. So just to sort of summarise the decision process, when considering impact-based warnings, it's complex, it's multifaceted. It requires the integration of multiple factors which aren't always meteorological, objective, or easily quantifiable, and the incorporation of input from multiple sources which aren't always digitised or readily available. And so the decision process is difficult to formalise, consistency is challenging, and there are inevitably heuristics and cognitive biases that come into play because it's humans making these decisions. On the other hand, because a lot of this data is not digitised, it's impossible to automate or replicate through any automated system. So it also evidenced the significant value of the human in this particular flagship safety of life service. And so as a result of this sort of problem statement, we've developed some training for the meteorologists on decision science, on cognitive biases, on heuristics. We've piloted that last year and it went down really well. And one of the key insights I got from delivering that training was that the meteorologists who have a strong physical science background are really reticent to use what they call intuition or gut feeling. But actually, if you reframe that as experience and expertise, suddenly it seems much more valuable, and they're happy to do that. So this is my key message to the meteorologists and other decision makers: is don't see your intuition as a negative. There's probably a lot of evidence behind those gut feelings. So I think that was it. And we have a stretch break. I incidentally often use my cats in what I'm going to call a interspecies transdisciplinary way in my presentations, and I didn't today, so I'm really happy to see this guy.
Thank you very much. Helen, you'll have to tell us the name of the cat now.
I don't know that one. Mine are Buddy, Bluebell and Mimi.
Thank you, and thanks to all four of you for keeping brilliantly to time and for introducing a lot of very thought-provoking ideas and concepts and sharing your own experience.